I was a college student in a small town, working part-time at a diner on the night shift. It was an old-fashioned place, the kind that's barely changed in decades, with cracked leather booths and neon lights that buzzed overhead. Most nights were quiet, just a few regulars who'd come in for coffee or a late meal after work. But one night, something changed. It was around 2 a.m., and the diner was empty except for me and the cook in the back. A man walked in. He was tall, dressed in a long dark coat with his collar turned up. His face was partially hidden by a baseball cap pulled low. There was something off about him, though I couldn't put my finger on it right away. He slid into a booth in the far corner, away from the windows and lights. I went over to take his order, and his voice was low, almost a whisper. He ordered a coffee but didn't look at the menu. His eyes were fixed on the table, and he didn't make eye contact with me once. Something about his presence made my skin crawl, but I tried to shake it off. I brought his coffee and tried to be friendly. He didn't say anything, just nodded. After a few minutes, I noticed he wasn't drinking his coffee or even looking at it. Instead, he was staring directly at me. Not glancing, staring. It felt like he was studying me, his eyes intense and unnerving. I went back behind the counter, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But every time I looked up, his eyes were locked on me. My gut was telling me something wasn't right. I mentioned it to the cook in the back, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably some drunk who wandered in. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? A customer is staring at me? That didn't seem like enough of a reason. Still, I felt uneasy, so I decided to keep my distance. After a while, the man got up and went to the bathroom. I let out a sigh of relief, glad to be free of his stare for a moment. But when he came out, I noticed something chilling. He wasn't alone. There was no one else in the diner, and I hadn't heard anyone come in. But when he walked back to his booth, there was a second man following behind him, identical in height, clothes, and demeanor. They both sat down at the same booth, neither acknowledging the other. I froze. My mind was racing. I couldn't understand how this second person had appeared, but there they were, both sitting silently, staring at me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel my palms start to sweat. Suddenly, the man who'd first walked in stood up and walked to the door. He didn't say anything or pay his bill, just walked out into the night. I expected the second man to follow, but he didn't. He just sat there, staring at me. I didn't know what to do. I went to the cook in the back and told him what happened. But when we came out, the second man was gone. His coffee cup sat on the table, still full, just like the first man's. I checked the bathroom. Empty. We searched the entire diner, but there was no sign of him. The cook tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a weird coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I quit the job the next day and never went back to that diner. A few weeks later, I heard a story on the news about a string of disappearances in our area. All the victims had last been seen late at night, and the description of the suspect matched the man from the diner. To this day, I have no idea who or what that second figure was, but I'm convinced that if I hadn't left that job, I would have been the next one to disappear. It was late, around 1 a.m., and I was the only waitress working the graveyard shift at a small 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. The place was mostly empty, save for a few regulars who sat nursing their coffees in silence. The night was thick with fog, making it impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the windows. The neon sign outside flickered erratically, casting an eerie red glow into the room. The front door creaked open, and a man stepped in. He was tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes and pale skin that looked almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. He wore a tattered old coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. Something about him made me instantly uncomfortable, but I greeted him as politely as I could. He chose the booth furthest from the entrance, right in the back corner where the lights seemed to dim just a little more than anywhere else. I walked over to take his order, but he didn't look up. His voice was low and raspy as he asked for a cup of coffee and nothing else. As I poured his coffee, I couldn't help but feel his eyes on me, even though he kept his head down. When I brought the cup to his table, he still wouldn't meet my gaze. His hands, pale and bony, wrapped around the cup, but he never took a sip. He just sat there, motionless, staring at the steaming liquid. I returned to the counter, trying to shake the feeling of unease that was creeping over me. The diner felt too quiet, and the fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. Every time I glanced toward the man, he was still sitting perfectly still, his coffee untouched. About half an hour passed when something strange happened. The man at the booth suddenly turned his head toward the window. I followed his gaze, but all I saw was a wall of fog. Yet his expression changed. It was as if he saw something out there, something I couldn't. His pale lips twisted into a strange, almost satisfied smile. Suddenly, the lights in the diner flickered. For a split second, the entire place was plunged into darkness, and when the lights came back on, the man was gone. His coffee cup remained on the table, still full and steaming, but the seat was empty. I checked the front door, still closed. There was no way he could have left without me hearing it. I even walked outside, calling into the fog, but there was no sign of him. Shaken, I returned to the diner and tried to make sense of what had just happened. As I went to clear his table, I noticed something chilling. On the booth seat where he had been sitting, there was an imprint, like the seat had been burned, a dark, shadowy outline of a figure scorched into the leather. That night, I closed the diner early and never worked the graveyard shift again. To this day, I have no idea who or what that man was, but I'm certain he wasn't human.